If you'd open your Bibles to Matthew 28. Where we read that on the first day, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, right? Because, the other Mary doesn't get a surname, just the other one, went to the tomb where Jesus had been laid, and they went early. So early, in fact, that the sun hadn't begun to come up yet. How many of you get up before the sun comes up and are off to work?
Well, we get up.
Get up. That can be a weird time for people. The day doesn't feel like it's begun yet. And for those who are living in light of Jesus' crucifixion, this is still a dark time. They come, though, to the tomb. And Matthew doesn't give us any indication of these women, the motivations of these women. He just says they went. On the night when Jesus was put into the tomb, these same Marys, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, listed in both places just as the other Mary, were there as well, sitting opposite the tomb. And we learn that they actually were also at the cross from a distance, but there nonetheless. In fact, Matthew tells us that these women, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee, were just a few among many women who watched Jesus on the cross from a distance. This group of women, Matthew tells us, had followed Jesus all the way from Galilee, ministering to him along the way. We also know, because they show up in the story quite frequently, that men had followed Jesus from Galilee. And we know some of them by name: Peter and James and John and Matthew and Judas. But unlike the women present at the cross, there at the tomb and then returning early on Sunday morning, these men haven't been seen nor heard from since they left Jesus running in fear in the garden. Women, the faithful followers of Jesus even to the end, while the men are nowhere to be found. In the ancient world, this is a strange story to tell. But Matthew's gospel has been preaching a strange, backwards, upside-down story from the very beginning. At the very beginning of Matthew's gospel, as it opened, as we spent weeks leading up to Christmas last year, we heard stories about Tamar and Rahab and Ruth and Bathsheba, women who encountered Israelite men, Judah, a couple of spies, Boaz and David. And only Boaz of these men had demonstrated any kind of faithfulness to any of these women. And yet, in spite of these men and their very best efforts to hurt and reject these women, pushing them away, God somehow embraces each of them. Some of them foreigners, some of them sinners, some of them enemies. He embraces them and he welcomes them among his people, giving them a place of honor in the family line of Jesus. This is the kind of good news that Matthew has been telling from the very beginning, that the humble will be made great and the great will be humbled. As Matthew continues to tell a story, after giving us these sort of lists of generations, Matthew then tells us about a king, a self-proclaimed king, a guy named Herod the Great, who was made to look like a fool by a group of foreigners who come searching for the true king of the Jews, a tiny toddler born in awkward circumstances. Matthew told us that this child king would save his people from their sins. This is good news. Matthew is obsessed with good news, and his good news reaches into every area of life. He announces that good news will reach out and touch the poor in spirit, who will inherit the abundance of God's kingdom. That there is good news for those who mourn because God is eager to comfort. That there is good news for those who show mercy that they will be shown mercy, and that there's good news for those who are peacemakers, as they will be called sons and daughters of God. In God's kingdom, the humble are esteemed. And as Matthew has been telling us the story that we've been in for these last several months, the rich and the honorable, the powerful and the influential are told to check their things at the door. The wealth of the rich might buy them treasures on earth, but their wealth has no value in God's kingdom. The honorable might have developed quite the following, but at Jesus' table, all are called servants. The powerful might be feared by many, but even their strongest and most dangerous of death-dealing weapons are proven inefficient in the face of a God who raises the dead. And this is the key to the good news that Jesus has written about. This is a story that only makes sense when it's told backwards. Jesus is the Messiah, only if he has been raised from the dead. The kingdom that Jesus preaches only makes sense if Jesus has been raised from the dead. The call to follow Jesus is only possible if Jesus has been raised from the dead. Paul tells us, as we heard from Robert and Jay, that we are still in our sins if Jesus has not been raised from the dead. For us, the resurrection is central. It is crucial for us as the heart of our trust in this God. And so let's explore for a few moments what Matthew has to say about the resurrection. And I want to look at the resurrection with two questions. The first question is this: if the dead are raised, what else might we need to rethink? And the second question is, if Jesus was right that God would raise him from the dead, what else can we trust him about? Did you get those? The two, if the dead are raised, what else might we need to rethink? And two, if Jesus was right about being raised from the dead, what else can we trust him about? These questions aren't totally different, but they come at the resurrection from slightly different angles. And so you'll see some overlap between the answers, but hopefully you'll hear how both of these questions give us some sort of insight as to how people live and walk and know God in light of the resurrection. So, first question: if the dead are raised. That's a big if, right? We can't even get through the first question without facing a major obstacle. If then. The then only matters if the if is true. But in this case, the if is kind of ridiculous. What if the dead are raised is kind of like asking, what if stars were just giant pimples of enormous space creatures? That's pretty ridiculous. Resurrection is a theme more suitable to science fiction or fantasy than history, because 100% of human beings that have died stay dead. For the rare occurrence where someone appears to have been dead but is resuscitated, it's important to note that these people have not avoided death, they've merely postponed it. That the dead stay dead is one of the most foundational of all human truths, trusted and accepted from our earliest days. That the sun will rise in the morning is maybe the only equivalent to things that we can trust about the way that the world works. Some have assumed that this day, it makes it much harder to accept the truth of the resurrection than it was like 2,000 years ago. Because, those ancient people, so superstitious, believed in magic and had these fantastical ideas associated with their religions. But the truth is, 2,000 years ago, people were just as convinced as we are today that dead people stay dead. Today, you'll hear people argue that the resurrection of Jesus is just not possible. that the story about Jesus being raised was some sort of myth that developed by a bunch of superstitious, naive, pre-scientific idiots. But what's funny about that is that Matthew himself, within a generation of these events, is describing the very same skepticism. Matthew tells us that there's a rumor that's been going around for decades among the Jewish people that Jesus' body was stolen by the disciples while the guards were sleeping. This is clearly the only valid explanation for what has happened. In every time and in every place, the message of the resurrection has been doubted and it has been opposed. Even in verse 17, we read that of the male disciples who saw Jesus, some doubted. Resurrection is no easy pill to swallow. If someone can tell you that they believe in the resurrection with no problem, I would be concerned. I would wonder whether that person is truly loving God with their whole mind, because it seems that they have turned their mind off in some way. Because we know rationally, emotionally, experientially that the dead stay dead 100% of the time. This is just what we know. If we are able to trust that God raised Jesus from the dead, it is not because we somehow thought ourselves there, or that we somehow reasoned, oh yeah, it totally makes sense that somebody would come back from the dead. If we are able to trust this news, scriptures tell us it is only because the Spirit of God has enabled us to trust the witness of the apostles, those who announced they had seen Jesus raised. We heard Paul say it earlier as Jay and Robert were reading in his letter to the Corinthians, the first letter he wrote to them. They said that Jesus was raised from the dead is something that Peter saw and James saw and the apostles saw and 500 others saw and experienced, and they've been spreading the word about. And so the resurrection is just not something that we can prove. It's something that we take this group's word on, trusting that the Spirit was at work, helping them faithfully tell us what they've seen. There's a reason I'm spending so much time with this, because in every time and in every place, the message of the resurrection has been doubted and opposed. Because if the dead can be raised, man, there's so much more that we need to begin rethinking about the way that this world might be and work. And Matthew has already actually begun to lead us toward rethinking the world. Mary went to the tomb. And there was an earthquake, and an angel appeared, and the guards were terrified and became like dead men. But the women listened. And the angel announced the good news to these women. He's not here, for he has risen, as he said. But then the angel does something truly bizarre. The angel instructs these women to go quickly and tell his disciples that Jesus has risen from the dead. Tell them he is going before you to Galilee. You will see him there. See, I have told you. So, tasked with a message and a mission, the women did exactly what any good and faithful servant would do. They departed quickly, we're told, from the tomb with great fear and great joy, and they ran to tell his disciples. Women are the first preachers of resurrection. Let me say this. If God was primarily concerned with matters of effectiveness, effective ministry, effective preaching, ministry and preaching that is most likely to affect the desired response in hearers, God made a poor choice with the Marys. Men, 2 of them to be specific, was the bare minimum of what you needed to convince people that you were testifying about something that was true. You can doubt the testimony of a single man, and you can doubt anything a woman tells you. This is in the ancient world. This is the way the world worked. Men were seen as trustworthy, women not so much so. But if God can raise the dead, then certainly women can be faithful and trustworthy witnesses and preachers, right? Or maybe the angel was confused. Or who knows, the angel could have been instructed to talk to Peter and James. But when the Marys came, the angel just was so excited, it couldn't wait and just told them to do it instead. I don't know if you've ever come across this, but I have seen people go through some pretty exciting and crazy mental gymnastics to avoid accepting some of the things the Bible claims. And this is one of those places where I've heard some interesting suggestions about how maybe the angel missed its mark. It's crazy. But Matthew clears up any question or confusion that there might be about whether the women were supposed to be tasked as resurrection preachers in the first place, because in verse 9, Jesus meets them. And with a simple greeting, the women, they grab hold of his feet, his physical resurrected feet, and they worship him. And they worship him because they know who he is, and they know that he is deserving of all of their honor and of all glory. And so then Jesus confirms the message that the angel gave them. Jesus says to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." If the dead are raised, we have to rethink the place of women in our world, Matthew says. We have to rethink the place of women in our households and in our churches. An incredible tragedy has been that for most of the church's history, it has tried to worship a resurrected Jesus while maintaining a firm grip on dead ways of viewing women. And so we need to allow the resurrection to renew our minds so that we can walk in new ways, resurrection ways, kingdom ways. Matthew leads us toward another way of rethinking the world, in addition to the place that women might have among God's people. When Jesus then sends the Marys to the disciples, he says something strange. "Tell my brothers to go to Galilee." Well, Jesus has already made clear earlier in the gospel that his brothers are those who do the will of the Father. And if we could say anything about the disciples, the male disciples in recent days, it's that they have been concerned with other things than the will of the Father as they flee the garden and they hide and they cower. It seems as though human failure doesn't have the final word. It would seem that grace is indeed greater than all of our sin. Here, Jesus speaks of his brothers who just days ago denied him, who abandoned him in his darkest and loneliest and most painful of moments. And yet Jesus seems eager to restore them, to name them once again as his brothers, and to task them with continuing his work in the world, continuing what the women began. See, in the world we live in, failures are often final failures. At least that's the way we treat them. Sinners get their due. When people hurt us, we sweep them away. When people wrong us, we hold it against them. We keep balance sheets. We weigh the scales. This is the way the world works. Almost as surely as the sun will rise in the morning. But if the dead are raised, then maybe it's possible for even sinners to be forgiven. Not 7 times, but 70 times 7. And all we would have to do is work our way through Matthew's gospel and identify each of Jesus' teachings that seem impossible and say, if the dead are raised, then maybe I need to rethink the world in light of this. Rethinking the world is about developing new categories of what is and of what isn't possible, and what is and what isn't worthwhile, and what is and what isn't of value. So that in our minds, we begin to imagine the world as an altogether different sort of place. And so that in our beings, we find ourselves driven by altogether different sorts of desires. And so that in our hands and in our feet, we begin to live as though we have an altogether different God who doesn't seem to understand this world as it is, because he's calling us to be people of a different kind of world. And so if the dead are raised, what else do we need to rethink? But moving on to our second question. If Jesus told the truth about being raised, what else do we need to trust Jesus about? That Jesus is raised from the dead shouldn't have been a surprise. And just to offer a quick survey of the things that Jesus had to say about what would follow his death, we read in chapter 16:21, Jesus says, "From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and on the third day be raised." In chapter 17:9, "And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, 'Tell no one the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead.'" Chapter 17, 22 to 23, "As they were all gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to his disciples, 'The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day.'" Chapter 20, verses 17 and 19. "And as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside, and on the way he said to them, 'See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and he will be raised on the third day.'" And then in chapter 26, 30 to 32, following the Passover, when he sang a hymn together, they went out to the Mount of Olives, and then Jesus said, "You will all fall away because of me this night. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." 5 times, Jesus speaks about being raised from the dead. Apparently, Jesus said it often enough that the officials in Jerusalem realized that they needed to take some sort of special precautions. And so we actually read in chapters 27, "The next day after the crucifixion, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate, and they said, 'Sir, we remember how that impostor said while he was still alive, "After 3 days I will rise." Well, therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the third day, so that his disciples cannot go and steal him away and tell the people he is risen from the dead. And the last fraud will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can." So they went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. I think there's a clear reason why the disciples didn't think that Jesus was going to come back from the dead. Because people don't come back from the dead, right? Even the authorities knew that Jesus wasn't actually going to be raised from the dead, but they were nervous about what might happen if the people believed he did, and so they set a guard to seal the tomb. They specifically made a precaution against the very sort of rumor that then would circulate for a decade or several decades, even though those who had seen Jesus raised knew the truth. I think sometimes we ignore Jesus' teachings because we simply cannot imagine a world where people do the sorts of things that Jesus has called us to do. These are not normal things to do. These are not normal ways of getting on in the world. And so sometimes we ignore Jesus' teachings because we just can't fathom what it looks like. And so this becomes one of the tasks of the church, to practice these sorts of things together, to learn how to be these kinds of people, so that as we gather together, we practice being the kinds of people that Jesus is calling us to be. And so that then as we're sent into the world, we're capable, as we stay connected in our households, in our small groups, to be these kinds of people in our workplaces, in our neighborhoods, in the places where we interact with those who need to hear a word of resurrection. Sometimes we ignore Jesus' teachings, not just because we can't imagine what it would look like, but because we just are convinced they're impossible to live out. That we can sometimes have a tendency to rationalize our lives and our behaviors and our desires and our thoughts and our actions by saying that it would be impossible to take Jesus at his word. Right? There is no way that we can live free of worry about tomorrow. That's just not reality. There's no way that we could actually make disciples. There's no way I'm capable of doing that. There's no way that I could ever forgive that person. There is no way that I could ever love that enemy. But this morning, the word of resurrection calls us into a bigger, better world with a better imagination and a new trust. A new trust that the kingdom that Jesus is forming is real and true and possible, and that what we need to live this out is available to us by God's Spirit as God's Spirit indwells our lives and we begin to walk this out in communities of faith that will fail. As the disciples, we'll find ourselves failing along the way, stumbling, finding ourselves denying, and yet finding at every moment Jesus eager to call us brothers and sisters. That we would know that truth, that we are a part of God's family, and that we're in this together. And that as people see us and the way that we live and the way that we love and the way that we live in unity, that people will catch a glimpse of the glory of God. They'll see the truth of resurrection as we live in ways that just make no sense and that seem impossible. If God can raise the dead, what else is God capable of? If God has raised Jesus from the dead, what else will you trust him about?